Texo, take her down.
Take her down, aye, sir.
You can stop the dive. Take her down to 100 feet.
Take her down to 100 feet!
Take her down! Sir! Fire!
Take her down! Take her down! Captain, I said take her down!
You've heard it said in every single submarine movie you've ever seen. But do you know where it came from? It was the final order of one heroic submarine commander who gave up his life to save his ship and his men, knowing that if he took the time to escape, they all would be lost. So Howard Walter Gilmore said, "Take her down," knowing he would not survive. His final order, which has become a legendary phrase in the U.S. submarine force. This is Madam Morbid. I am your guide on any number of historical adventures. And today, we are going to talk about the life of Medal of Honor winner Howard Walter Gilmore. Howard Walter Gilmore was born September 29th, 1902, in Selma, Alabama. He was the oldest son of Walter Gilmore and Vernon Howard Gilmore. That is his mother, and he named his daughter Vernon after her. He had a younger brother, Francis. His brother was about 6 years younger than him. He was a football star and expected to go really far. But on April 19th, 1928, while he was attending Loyola University, as he was leaving a dance, he was hit by a hit-and-run driver. He was with a friend who narrowly managed to jump out of the way, and it severed his spine, and he was taken to the hospital and didn't make it. 1 year later, his mother died in 1929. She was only 51 years old. I don't know what illness she had, but it said she died in an infirmary, so she was sick with something. So a lot of sadness in his life. When he was 18 years old in 1920, he enlisted in the Navy. In 1922, he earned a place at the Naval Academy by taking a competitive exam. Howard's nickname was either Gil or Count. This is what it says in their yearbook, The Lucky Bag, in 1926. It says, "The Count comes from New Orleans, where the cotton grows rampant and the Negroes sing all night in the mellow light of the moon. Many will attest to his loving ways, charming stories, and unruffled disposition, the latter shown by the complacent way in which he lets the whole deck bum his skags." A skag is a cigarette. 18 months in the Navy before he entered the academy made him seemingly impervious to women. Although we stop and wonder when we see the color of some of his letters. He is famed for red hair and freckles, as well as his savviness, which persists in spite of his passionate love for tormenting tales and other literature which he read to broaden his mind and enlarge the scope of his activities. Gil was one of the prominent members of the 4th Deck Purity League, founded youngster year and known the Academy over for the songs of melody and variety of its members. The others gave the melody, and he furnished the variety. He insists, though, that he is a real leader of men, and proves it by telling you to look up the old Anglo-Saxon meaning of Walter. I did just that. Walter in Germanic means army ruler or powerful ruler. Basically, Walter's a powerful dude. He graduated number 34 in a class of 436. He was commissioned in 1926 and was originally assigned to the battleship USS Mississippi BB-41. Howard married in 1929 to Margaret Persis Birtwell. She was the daughter of Dr. Daniel T. Birtwell of Washington, D.C. He must have met her through her brother Daniel, who was in his same graduating class, 1926. What's interesting about Daniel is he was one of the 335 survivors of the USS Arizona in the attack on Pearl Harbor. In the Lucky Bag, The childhood picture on his entry contains a picture of him with Margaret. This group photograph is from her high school yearbook. She's about 16 years old. No one in this photograph was identified. Their names were listed in alphabetical order. So I compared this childhood photograph with all of the women in this picture. And I believe this is her. And I think it's her because the forehead is very similar, and the eyes, the brow region. And if you compare her to her brother's photograph, I think there's a family resemblance. So I'm pretty comfortable saying of the women in this photograph, I think it's her. She had gone to Central High School and was the class poet in the class of 1924. She had gone to Goucher College, where she graduated in 1928. She was in the French and Spanish clubs and Alpha Gamma Delta. According to the newspaper article describing their wedding, she wore a brown traveling gown. She had a bouquet of roses and lilies of the valley. Unfortunately, their marriage was very brief because she died on July 3rd, 1930. They were only married for a matter of months, and it seems she died of polio. So just think about that. In that 3-year period, he lost his brother in 28, his mother in 29, and his wife in 1930, all while just beginning his career. He began submarine training in 1930 and served in various submarines and stations ashore in the period after that. He served as an executive officer of USS Shark, SS-174. While he was serving on the Shark, he was almost killed. Gilmore was on a shore excursion in Panama with a junior officer of the Shark, Charles Otto Treble. They were both attacked by a group of hoodlums. Both had their throats cut. They did both survive and carried scars with them for the rest of their lives. In 1932, he married Hilda St. Raymond. Hilda was one of 4 kids. She had an older brother, Charles, and she had 2 younger sisters, Lorraine and Dorothy. Her dad was Charles St. Raymond, and he was a bank vice president. He started out as cashier. He worked for the Citizens Bank and Trust Company in New Orleans. Her family had lived in New Orleans for generations. Now I noticed that her father died really young, and I was trying to figure out why. And I came across the papers from his will and estate, and just all of this money went to other people. None of it went to his family. And I'm thinking, what in the world is going on here? And I go into the newspapers and search there, and I found that in 1923, and I don't know if his family knew about this, but they were starting to look into his accounts. There was $94,000 missing from the bank. I don't know if he stole that money or lost it, but he didn't want to deal with the consequences of this, so he went in his garage and was found with a gun lying next to him. I don't think his family got much of anything. $46,000 of his estate went back to the bank. He left his poor wife Alice with 4 kids, ranging in age from 1 to 17, to take care of on her own and to clean up the mess he had made at the bank. By the way, he did this November 27th, 2 days after Hilda turned 15 years old. Howard married Hilda on June 28, 1932, in New Orleans. And over the next few years, they had 2 kids. Their son, Howard Walter Gilmore Jr., was born in 1933, and their daughter, Vernon Jean Darlene, was born in 1937. In 1941, Howard had his first command of the USS Shark, SS-174. Howard was given command of the Growler a mere days after Pearl Harbor. I wonder if he knew that his former brother-in-law and schoolmate barely survived that attack. I don't know if they kept in touch. The Growler wasn't even completed. It had launched in November, but was still being fitted. Right before Howard left for the Pacific, Hilda fell down a flight of stairs, and she was still unconscious when he had to leave. He just seemed to have such rotten luck. His fellow officer from the Shark, who was attacked in Panama when he was, Treble, later said, quote, "Howard was one of the finest men I ever knew, but he was born under an unlucky star." The USS Drum is going to serve as our Growler. USS Growler was lost during the war. It was a Gatto-class submarine, just like Drum. Drum was built a little earlier. There were alterations made to the conning tower area of the Growler. But inside, it is very much the same. USS Drum is located in Mobile, Alabama at Battleship Memorial Park. This particular submarine was launched on May 12th, 1941, and it's been a museum ship since 1969. Growler launched on November 22nd, 1941. Both submarines were built by the Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut. It was a diesel-electric submarine. It's 311 feet 9 inches long, 27 feet 3 inches wide. It could travel 21 knots, or about 24 miles per hour surfaced, and 9 knots, or 10 miles per hour submerged. It could travel about 13,000 miles surfaced at 10 knots. It could stay out for 75 days, but Growler's patrols usually lasted about 45 to 50. Growler could accommodate a maximum of 65 men, 58 enlisted, and 7 officers. The crew took up residence in the Growler on March 20th, 1942. They spent a few months in New London, Connecticut, training and making sure Growler was fitted and ready for combat before heading to the Pacific. What was life like on a submarine? You enter the tour into the forward torpedo room. Each of the 6 torpedo tubes carried a torpedo, and then there were 8 reloads stowed within this compartment. There would have also been 15 bunks for the enlisted men. The stairway I came down was the hatch where they loaded the torpedoes into the ship. That was not a stairway back in wartime. Anything they might need, they had to bring with them. There was no store like you would have had on a battleship or an aircraft carrier. If you forgot something, you were just out of luck. They stuffed stuff in every single cranny they could find. The shower would have been full of stuff that guys were storing. They would have only bathed maybe once every 10 days. Showers were not used while on patrol. Sometimes, if they were surfaced and it was raining, guys could go up there and wash off. Other times, if they were submerged, they might use the condensation from the walls to clean up a little bit. There was a huge ration on fresh water. Laundry would have been absolutely unthinkable. This vessel would have smelled very bad. It would have been a combination of body odor, diesel, whatever food was being cooked. Guys would have been smoking in here. Most of the time, they were surfaced if they could be. But anytime they headed toward enemy waters, they had to dive. And the air would have been very stale. The longer they're down, the worse the air is going to get. One of the ways the guys knew the air had gotten really, really bad was if their cigarettes wouldn't light because there wasn't enough oxygen. This is the area where the officers dined. It looks quite comfortable. There might have been room for all 7 to eat at the same time. There seems to be space for more than the 7 officers who would have been on board. There were 2-man staterooms, 3-man staterooms, and 4-man staterooms. I want to point out the canvas bags you see hanging off the bar of the bunk. Guys could store personal belongings in that. Welcome to Commander Gilmore's stateroom. It would have been identical to this. It's basically the size of a cubicle that you would see in an office building. I can just imagine if he might have had pictures of Hilda and the children on his desk here. It was interesting, the person in the tour ahead of me, when he was looking at the captain's quarters, said, "Man, they must have hated who was in here. This is so tiny." And I said, "This is the captain's area. This is literally as good as it gets." It's just hard for us to understand what conditions were like. I mean, we're a very spoiled society. As you leave the officers' quarters, you come to the ship office. It was hard to film because of this gate. And from the officer quarters, you enter the control room. Any operations having to do with diving, surfacing, changing depth, orders given to the engines, steering the ship, all of this was done here, as well as it could be done in the conning tower, which is right above this. The two big wheels control depth. The wheel on the right controls the bow planes. Bow planes control the depth. The wheel on the left is for the stern planes. That controls the angle. Above the left wheel, you see the stern plane angle indicator, so they could look at that and it would tell them what degree of angle they were at. Sailors who worked here were known as planesmen. When on the surface, planesmen served as lookouts. There was a shallow water gauge, which was used in depths of up to 165 feet. Then there was the deep gauge, which could go to 450. Now the drum was tested at 312, and anything below that, there was no guarantee that things would hold up. The drum did go below 400 feet a few times to evade depth charges. The hull was 3/4 of an inch thick, so it did handle deep depths pretty well. They were well made. This is the hydraulic manifold. By opening these valves, you filled the ballast tanks and dove the submarine. This is the Christmas tree. It indicated the position of the ballast tank vents. Red meant they were open, and green meant they were closed. The trim and drain manifold in this aft corner was used to pump water from the trim tanks and from the bilges. It helped keep the boat level and maintain depth when they were going at slow speeds. Above and behind the bow planes and to the right of this ladder going to the conning tower was a bathothermograph. It recorded seawater temperature. This is the general area it is supposed to be in, but I'm not sure which of these devices is it. If a submarine could find a drastic temperature change, they could hide underneath that layer and sonar couldn't penetrate it. This particular bathothermograph still works, but it's measuring air temperature rather than water temperature. To the right of the bow planes is a ladder going down, and that went to the pump room where there was the trim, the drain pumps, the air compressors, the refrigeration plant, hydraulic pumps, and other equipment. It's a really tight fit down there, so any sailor who was an auxiliary man had to be very skinny. I was trying not to catch people on film, so I just barely caught the ladder going to the conning tower by accident as I was carrying my camera at my side. I actually flipped this. This was recorded upside down. You could see it. It's just right behind that bow and stern plane wheels. Welcome to the conning tower, which is right above the control room. I was nervous about climbing the ladder, but I did get my uncoordinated, middle-aged butt up that ladder and into that tiny little conning tower. All of us tourists had to take turns. Only about 5 or 6 of us could comfortably be in that area, and it was impossible to film that without getting other people on film. This is the periscope. Periscope was used to see targets when they are submerged, and it still worked. It was very yellow when you looked into it. It was aimed at the USS Alabama. I tried to get a picture of what it looked like, but it didn't come out. It just was yellow. When they are in battle, this is where Gilmore would have been giving his orders, looking through the periscope, stalking their targets, and delivering orders to the torpedo rooms, the engine rooms. The ship could have been steered from the conning tower as easily as below. After leaving the control room, you enter the areas for the enlisted men. The first place you arrive is the galley. The only advantage guys had on the submarines was they were given the best food possible. I guess it was a way of saying, yeah, we're kind of making up for, we know your conditions living are pretty uncomfortable and terrible, so we're going to give you some pretty good food. Here's where the food was prepared. I would imagine there was only one cook. I would hate to be going around a second person in a kitchen like this. See this container here with spigots for the guys to fill their drink. I don't know if this held coffee, water. Right next to the kitchen, this is where the enlisted men ate. They had to eat very quickly before they had to go back to their stations. Usually had about 10 minutes. 65 of them needed to eat, so they had to do that in shifts. All of the tables have a lip on them, so if the waters are rough, your food, drinks don't fall off of the table as the ship moves. And you see here there's a slot there where the cook could hand food to the enlisted men on the other side. Every single guy on board a submarine would have known the purpose and use of every single valve, knob, switch, because if you're in an emergency, water's coming in and you need to shut certain valves, everybody needs to know what to do. This is the main crew berthing area. It had 36 bunks in it. Sometimes the guys would do what they called hot bunking. One guy would get up and go on duty, and another guy would come in and take his place, and then that guy would sleep. These bunks could fold up to get out of the way when they weren't being used. Guys kept their uniforms underneath the mattresses on their bunk. They also had lockers available and canvas bags. The batteries were also stored in this area, and the batteries were dangerous. They ventilated them to prevent buildup of hydrogen gas because they would give that off when they were charging. And basically they could explode. It's thought that some of the subs that were lost in the war may have been because of that. Another thing that might happen is if seawater comes in and touches the batteries, they give off chlorine gas. So yeah, that's something you really want to be sleeping next to. At the end of this area was the showers and the head or the toilet. But life in a submarine would have been a lot of boredom, nothing, followed by short periods of excitement, stalking enemy vessels and sinking them. And the Growler was quite successful. They would go out for about 75 days is the maximum they could stay out before they had to come back, refit, rest up, get rejuvenated before they did it again. They set sail May 4th, 1942 from New London, Connecticut, headed to Coco Solo in the Canal Zone. Growler then headed to Pearl Harbor, where she found out what her assigned patrol area was going to be. Then they stopped off at Midway Island on June 24th, and they entered their area of patrol on June 30th. One of the problems the Navy had when World War II first started was their submarine commanders came from guys who had been in the Navy a long time. They had graduated from Annapolis, and they were used to patrolling in peacetime, where the emphasis was on getting your vessel home. So a lot of them weren't very aggressive, and that's one thing that made Gilmore stand out. He was not afraid of combat. He was not afraid to be aggressive, to go after targets. In the book Silent Victory by Clay Blair Jr., he describes Gilmore as, quote, practically fearless in combat. During their first battle off Kiska, Gilmore spotted 3 destroyers. They were anchored. They had just escorted a transport and a seaplane into port. And this is his first attack of the entire war. And he fired at all 3 of these destroyers at the same time. All 3 were struck. One did manage to fire back. They dove, and the crew reported that they heard the whine of those 2 torpedoes passing by. Gilmore thought he had sank all 3, but he actually only sank one of them. The other 2 were very badly damaged, but they were later repaired and returned to service. A few days after this, they tangled with another destroyer. This one was on patrol, and they really went after the Growler. They were aggressive and depth charged the crud out of them. That was the last action on that patrol. Rear Admiral Robert H. English wrote, quote, the first war patrol of the Growler was extremely well conducted, and the results were most gratifying. The attacks on the 3 destroyers merit the highest praise. And for that, Gilmore was awarded the Navy Cross. That is the service's second highest honor. They went out the second time on August 5th, 1942. They were patrolling near Taiwan. On August 23rd, they saw a freighter, so they surfaced to chase it. They fired 2 torpedoes at it. They missed. It's 5 a.m., August 25th. The Growler is submerged, and Gilmore orders up periscope to take a look around. When he came up, he found that he had sailed into the midst of a flotilla of 150 fishing boats. Those boats were around them for the next 3 hours. And once they got free, early that afternoon, he spotted the Senyo Maru, a 3,000-ton freighter. It took 4 torpedoes for them to sink them. They were depth charged for 3 hours. They didn't find anything else, so they shifted over to the other side of the island on the east side, where they ran across the Ifuku Maru. It was a 5,866-ton cargo ship. They sank it within 40 minutes of seeing it. That was August 31st, and then on September 4th, they sank Kashino, a 10,360-ton supply ship. 3 days after that, they sank a 2,204-ton cargo ship, the Taiku Maru. They hit it with 2 torpedoes. It broke in half and sank in 2 minutes. When Growler arrived September 23rd at the subbase at Midway, every single torpedo on board had been fired. Admiral English again wrote of Gilmore's performance that, quote, all attacks were aggressively prosecuted. He awarded him a second Navy Cross, which came in the form of a gold star to add to the one he already had. At this point in the war, he was considered one of the most successful submarine skippers in the U.S. Navy. After patrols 1 and 2, Growler's men rested up at Pearl Harbor. Their third patrol was in October. They were patrolling off Truk, T-R-U-K, in the Caroline Islands. Not much happened on Patrol 3. They were basically taking part in a reshuffling of submarine assets on the way to Brisbane, Australia, where the men would rest between patrols 3 and 4. Brisbane would have been full of Americans, submariners who were resting and unwinding after combat, drank, and played hard, just like they did at Pearl Harbor. Actually, their behavior was pretty worrisome to some of the higher ups. In January 1943, Growler left Brisbane for their 4th patrol. Commander Fife was on his radio every night, contacting Gilmore to direct him into the path of known convoys or other targets. On January 16th, Gilmore got a big 6,000-ton passenger cargo ship, Chifuku Maru. This was his 6th confirmed sinking. On January 31st, he attacked a 2,500-ton converted gunboat, but the single torpedo he fired ran under it without doing any damage. Several nights later, Fife put him on the trail of a small convoy, but there were escorts and Growler was having mechanical problems, so they weren't able to attack. Hayasaki was a Kenasaki-class food supply ship. When it tangled with the Growler, it's the first time the Hayasaki had seen action in the war. It left with a load of fresh food off Cape Pupukunu, supplies auxiliary seaplane tender Sanyo Maru on December 22, 1942, and set forth on a course, bringing them in direct line to intercept the Growler. It's 1 a.m., Sunday, February 7th. Growler is patrolling on the surface off the southwest coast of the Solomon Islands. Gilmore's second in command was Lieutenant Commander Arnold F. Shade. Shade said that night was very dark. Around 1:10, their radar picked up a blip at a range of 2,000 yards. Visibility was really bad, but the 4 lookouts spotted the ship on the horizon. It appeared to be a small gunboat that was moving away from them. Gilmore decided to give chase. All torpedo tubes were made ready, and he joined his men on the open-air bridge at the front of the conning tower. As they bore down on their target, slowly closing the gap, no one in the crew had noticed that the ship had spotted them and was headed straight for them. They had turned and were going to ram them. The men who were operating the torpedo data computer in the conning tower, this kept track of the range, speed, and course, announced they had locked onto the target. But seconds later, Executive Officer Arnold Shade called up to the bridge, "We're too close!" The exploders on the torpedoes had to have at least 500 yards to arm, and they just were too close now. It was too late to torpedo them, and it was too late to avoid getting hit. So Gilmore yelled, "Left full rudder!" and sounded the collision alarm. The collision occurred at 1:35 a.m. as Growler smashed into the port side of the Hayasaki. They were going 17 knots, and the first 15 feet of the bow bent nearly 90 degrees to port. Everybody was knocked off their feet. The sub began rolling at 50 degrees before slowly righting itself. Most electrical systems lost power immediately. There was a huge hole in the Hayasaki. Right after the collision, the enemy ship began raking the conning tower with machine gun fire. The only protection that any of the men had was this thin steel plate, and they were being hit by 50 caliber bullets. All 6 men on the bridge, including Gilmore, were hit. Gilmore ordered, "Clear the bridge!" and everyone tried to make it below, but only 3 did. Ensign William Williams and Fireman Wilbert F. Kelly were killed. Wounded men started dropping through the hatch. Some of them were very seriously hurt. Shade said that one man had his leg blown off and the other had lost his arm below the right elbow. Gilmore was the only soul left outside the sub, and what he saw was that they were drifting further and further away from Hayasaki, and any moment now they were going to be within range of their giant deck guns, which could have sent everybody to the bottom of the sea. They didn't have time to wait for him, so he ordered, "Take her down." Arnold Shade was standing at the bottom of the ladder, waiting for his captain to come down, but he never did. Instead, for second time, he said, "Take her down." And Arnold Shade had to close that hatch and order them submerged with his captain still outside. Diving at this time would have been terrifying. The ship was badly damaged. Their diving planes and forward torpedo tubes were useless. Bullet holes in the conning tower were letting in water. Shade said it caused them to lose auxiliary power and started an electrical fire. Men tried to seal the leaks as best they could, but they were not having much luck. After about 20 minutes, water in the bottom of the sub was 6 inches deep, and Shade took the chance that they could surface. He planned to finish the Hayasaki off, but when they got back to the surface, Hayasaki was gone. There was no sign of Commander Gilmore or the bodies of the 2 lost sailors. Shade was now the commander of Growler. Men began making as many repairs as they could to get it in enough shape to limp home. When asked about getting back to Brisbane, Shade said that 90-degree bend in the bow meant they had to constantly engage the rudder in order to prevent them from just going in circles. Growler arrived back to Brisbane on February 17th. Growler required extensive repairs. The whole 18 feet of the front had to be replaced. The guys that worked on the refabricated bow put 2 nickel kangaroos as decoration, and from then on, it was known as the Kangaroo Express. Growler did not sink the Hayasaki. It was pretty severely damaged by the Growler, though, and had to have an extensive repairs. It was in numerous other engagements. Sometimes it was damaged, but never seriously to the point of putting it out of action. In 1947, Hayasaki was given as a part of war reparations to the Soviet Union, and it was renamed the Olekma. Howard was the first submarine commander to earn the Medal of Honor in World War II, but he would not be the last. 7 submarine commanders earned the Medal of Honor during the war. 4 of them did so posthumously. On July 13th, 1943, Admiral Andrew Carl Bennett, the Commandant of the 8th Naval District, presented the award to Hilda Gilmore. After placing it on her neck, Hilda then turned and placed it over the head of her 10-year-old son, Howard Jr. 2 months later, the submarine tender USS Howard W. Gilmore AS-16 was named for him and was sponsored by Hilda. Howard spent much of his childhood in Meridian, Mississippi. His mother's maiden name had been Howard, and the Lauderdale County Department of Archives and History placed a cenotaph in his mother's family plot at the Magnolia Cemetery in Meridian, Mississippi. Building 84 at the Naval Submarine Base in New London in Groton, Connecticut, has been named Gilmore Hall in honor of Commander Gilmore. After the war, Hilda had a job with the Navy. It drives me crazy, but I could not find how 18-year-old Howard Walter Gilmore Jr. died. But he died in New Orleans at 18 years old in 1953. And I can only speculate about what might have happened there. If you know that information, please tell me in the comments. And what's really sad is that Hilda also outlived her daughter. She died in 1986 at 48 or 49 years old. Hilda died 2 years later in 1988 at around 80 years old. Poor Hilda. Her father dying the way he did, losing her husband, losing her son, and then losing her daughter before herself. I just can't even imagine. Howard's father, he died 1 month after his only living son was killed. He had remarried because his stepmother was interviewed in an article about his death, and she said that he constantly worried about his son. He too had lost his first son at 19 years old, then he lost his wife, and here he was now losing the only son he had left. And maybe the grief and pain was just too much to bear and his body gave out. Growler completed 6 more patrols. After repairs, in the middle of June, with Arnold Shade now in command, Growler set off on their 5th patrol. Before her 9th patrol, on May 14, 1944, Shade was reassigned to another vessel, and command was given to Lieutenant Commander Thomas B. Oakley, Jr. Because he was transferred, Shade survived the war. Patrol number 11 would be her last. On November 8, 1944, Growler was the leader of a wolf pack. They closed on a convoy for attack. The last communication received from Growler was the order to attack. The other 2 submarines, Hake and Hardhead, heard what sounded like a torpedo explosion, followed by a series of depth charges on Growler's side of the convoy, and then they heard nothing. They tried for the next 3 days to contact Growler. She was listed as lost, cause unknown. Probably she was sank by destroyer Shigura and the coastal defense ships Chiburi and CD-19. Everybody on board, all 86 crew members, and the commander died in the sinking. In her career, Growler sank 15 enemy vessels for a total of 74,900 tons and damaged 7 for another 34,100 tons on her 11 patrols. Whether you knew it or not, many of you had probably seen stories inspired by Gilmore before. The 1958 film Operation Pacific, starring John Wayne and Ward Bond, included a scene where John Wayne had to leave his captain, played by Ward Bond, outside and dive the sub. Interestingly, Ward Bond also appeared in John Ford's short film, The Growler Story, made in 1957. In that, he played a fictionalized version of Lieutenant Commander Shade. In that, he left behind the captain, played by Ken Curtis. I didn't recognize him. How many of you know that name? Ken Curtis played Festus on Gunsmoke. Even when I knew it was him, I still had trouble recognizing him. He was so young and handsome and clean cut. And of course, U-571 had the scene where Bill Paxton, he's actually in the water, and he orders them to leave him behind to save themselves. But again, it's directly inspired by the sacrifice made by Howard Gilmore. I never would have known a thing about Howard Gilmore's story if there had not been 2 different memorials on display at the Drum. And so that's how I'm bringing you these stories. I'm bringing you stuff I come across in my travels. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you would like to support my work and the channel, I mean, it's just me. I do everything. And I'm also a mom to a 4-year-old, so sometimes it does take me a while to get stuff out because I'm really thorough too, especially in my research. I just love research, and I get lost in rabbit holes sometimes. But if you'd like to support my work and see more of it, please subscribe to the channel. Please hit like to tell the algorithm to show it to other people. Leave a comment. All of that helps so much in getting stuff out to an audience. And watch the whole thing. I'm also on Patreon. You can find me at patreon.com/MadamMorbid. And if you just want to send a note or comment or an idea, I also have an email at madammorbidtopics@gmail.com. I like hearing from fans. And to all of my current patrons, thank you so much for your support. It means the world to me. As long as you guys are watching, I'll keep making it. So thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you next time.
We have with us Captain Arnold F. Shade, the executive officer who succeeded to command of the Growler during her 4th patrol. Arnie, when I look at the pictures of the Growler's condition after her collision with that Japanese gunboat, I'm amazed that you and your crew were able to bring her to port.
Well, it not only looked bad, Tommy, it was. As you can see, the bow was bent almost 90 degrees to port. We had to carry lots of rudder all the way to prevent her from running in circles.
It took 3 months to put a new bow on and to make that boat ready for service again, didn't it?
That's right. But no matter what our achievement in bringing the Growler home, it pales to insignificance compared with Commander Gilmore's in saving all of us.
You're referring to the ramming of the gunboat?
Yes, the captain's quick action in calling for a sudden turn put the enemy in front of us and saved us from being rammed by him.